Hello, everybody. I'm George from Ireland. Well, thank you for coming back to my channel. And this is about the 70th anniversary of Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech, which he delivered on the 25th of February, 1956. Оккульта личности и его последствиях. So probably mispronounced that one. The cult of the personality and its secret and its consequences. So known as the secret speech, obviously speeches can't be secret, but I mean, it was to quite a small group at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. These congresses were only held every 3 years, roughly. Obviously, they weren't held in the Second World War. So Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin had died just 3 years earlier, and it wasn't clear who was top dog. Remember, Stalin had been chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, as well as first secretary of the Communist Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And first secretary went to Khruschev, if I got that right, and was it Nikolai Bulganin? He became chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. Who was the top dog? It was not blatant until 1956 that really it was Nikita Khrushchev who was in charge. This rather short, swine-faced chap from the very west of Russia, who'd been a gas fitter, whose parents had grown up in a very, one-horse town, and then moved to the Donbass and rose to the ranks of the Communist Party, was an absolutely ruthless witch-finder general in Ukraine in the 1930s for Stalin. And, Khrushchev is responsible for the Holodomor almost as much as Stalin. Was having peaceful dissidents tortured in the most monstrous ways for the mass murder of civilians and so on. And anybody suspected of trying to save his life by cooperating with the Axis in the Second World War, sent to the Gulag if they weren't shot on the spot. So he's an absolute monster. He's evil, going towards Stalin's part at the Blizhnaya Dacha, supposedly getting drunk, but he would just do anything for Stalin. So he was responsible for all these crimes as well. All right, so then he gave this speech to a stunned 20th Party Congress, a very select group. And he told people stuff which had been buried for about 35 years, about how when Vladimir Ilyich Lenin had realized that the icy hand of death would soon be upon him, he wrote his last will and testament saying that Stalin was too brusque, mustn't be the top leader, this comrade filing cabinet, no. Likewise, Trotsky and others were criticized by him. And this had been buried. Stalin had sort of hidden the files. I didn't know how Khrushchev had found them. Stalin, do you think you want to destroy all copies? But didn't quite manage to, and so on. And then he said that the Pospelov report on mass repression, I mean, repression doesn't do justice. This is enslavement of whole ethnic groups sent by cattle truck to the Gulag, many of them dying on the way, dying through malnutrition, dying through overwork, lack of adequate clothing in -30 temperatures, lack of any medical care, savage beatings, is like a concentration camp. Admittedly, the death rate wasn't quite as high, and a few people survived. So he said that Stalin had made some serious misjudgments before and during the Second World War. That's definitely true, not seeing the invasion coming and so forth, and actually facilitating the German invasion of Poland. That he didn't call that one out as an error, but he did, and selling lots of war material right before June 1941. Okay, so there have been terrible failures in agriculture, caused a million people starved to death. But, Khrushchev didn't report on the Holodomor, which he himself was very responsible for dekulakization, as in getting the more successful peasants and saying they were class enemies, sending them to Siberia or Karaganda or wherever. It was the stupidest thing he could have done. The better farmers were punished for succeeding, for producing more food, and so on. It didn't mention the Katyn massacre, about 20,000 Polish army officers, prisoners of war murdered in Kharkiv, Kalinin, and other places. Okay, or the mass deportation of any non-communist politician from Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. So it was mainly about how he said loyal communists were unjustly punished, but Khrushchev didn't care if non-communists suffered this one. But Khrushchev said he was an ardent communist himself. He lavished praise on Lenin and so on. But he said that obviously that Stalin was a deviationist, and he said that he'd disagreed with him. So there was this cult of personality. He was made a godlike figure. His image was omnipresent and so forth. He was praised to a sickening degree. It was just like risible things named in honor for him. And Moscow was even going to be named Stalinodar, as in Stalin's gift. But that was one vanity too much, even for Stalin, when the Politburo suggested it, a warship named after him in his lifetime, as though it's a monarch, Stalingrad for Volgograd, former Tsaritsyn, claiming that that was the key battle of the Civil War when Stalin was in charge, which it wasn't, who, by the way, was willing to take a trainload of food meant for Baku, so the people there starved. And so it's absolutely heartless, a very, very cruel, monstrous man. But Khruschev was almost as guilty, and so on. So, okay. And also he denounced Lavrenti Beria. He'd been executed on Christmas Eve, 1953, head of the Narodnya Komissariat Vnutrych Dел, as in the secret police, a fellow Georgian who'd been Stalin's henchman. So Khrushchev proved he was an orthodox Marxist. He was able to quote from the works of Lenin and Karl Marx, saying the cult of individuality is bad. We mustn't be adulating one person like this. People are flawed. Individuals don't matter. What matters is the masses, and so forth. Okay. And yeah, so quoting Lenin's last testament and by Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, remember she was the People's Commissar for Education, saying that Stalin had personality flaws. And Lenin had even recommended that Stalin be deposed as a Secretary General of the party, seemingly a tedious administrative role, but was very important to putting his cronies in high positions, especially over-promoting third-rate people who knew that they owed their office only to Stalin and therefore were blindly obedient to him. But Khrushchev, committed many of the same errors. And that Stalin said that various people were enemies of the people, which was preposterous, and so on. Okay, Stalin had not observed collective leadership despite paying lip service to it. Most of the old Bolsheviks of the 17th Party Congress, of almost 2,000, over half of them were called counter-revolutionaries, which they definitely weren't. 840 of them were executed, and so on. So these farcical show trials. Okay, so that was it. The false doctors plot claiming that doctors, particularly Jewish doctors, were poisoning people. That was right before Stalin died. So the socialist reality policy and the arts, which Andrei Zhdanov, the cultural secretary, had promoted, was preposterous as well. So it was printed out and it was only meant to be circulated amongst leading communists. Yeah. Anyway, so this eventually was leaked and a copy of it got into the Polish language. And then Mossad had an agent in Poland and he got it off his girlfriend and was translated to English. So it was published only 2 weeks, it's only a month later by the New York Times. So things are beginning to change. There's the thought. Now, it was still very much a totalitarian state, but it wasn't quite as insane and massively violent as it had been before. This is a step forward. And so you see how Putin has gone back to that cult of the personality, has started this war of aggression. But he's bitten off more than he can chew in Ukraine. Stalin, he'd invaded Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, and Romania. Now, he was wise in picking enemies he could easily defeat. Even some difficulty in Finland, he beat them after a few months. And then this sort of command economy, the no free expression, the no real elections, the no right to strike and so on, the no fair trial. So going back to totalitarianism, not quite, not the communist economic aspect of things, but it led people to think there might be freedom, which is why there's a Hungarian Revolution, and demonstrations in Poland, the Polish October, but some Georgians viewed as an insult to Georgia, and demonstrated because of that. Some were shot dead, being pro-Stalinist and so on. So that was at least a step in the right direction. But sadly, there's sort of re-Stalinization gone on. His cult of the personality has been rehabilitated. He's honored now. You're not to criticize him. We mustn't look at the negative aspects, just a few million murders. He was victorious in the Second World War. The Soviet Union was victorious despite him, not because of him, his many grave errors. And obviously, it throws into sharply embarrassing relief how inadequate Putin is by comparison. Putin, who hasn't won a war against a much smaller, weaker enemy than Germany. All right. Thanks for watching my channel. Make sure you subscribe on Patreon, donate PayPal, georgecallan79@gmail.com. Goodbye.